Good afternoon. I'm with Dr. Jeff Guhin, Assistant Professor Sociology at UCLA Los Angeles. Have I got that right?
Sure. UCLA Los Angeles is a bit redundant, but that's fine.
Thank you for taking your time this afternoon to talk about culture feed, and
Sure.
especially to talk about the research work you did in support of the book, The Content of Their Character. We studied about 10 sectors in total, and you were responsible through your research to study 6 urban American high schools.
Right.
And they were located in Charlotte, North Carolina, San Diego, California, and New York City, New York. And you made a number of visits to these schools?
Yeah, I was in each city for approximately 3 months. I was in New York City for a little bit longer. But yeah, I made around 15 to 20 visits to each school.
And do you think anything escaped you?
Sure, of course. I think most things escaped me. I mean, not most things, but a lot. I mean, I'm trained as an ethnographer, and so that's not really enough time to do what most people would consider as serious ethnography. So, I wish I had been there longer, but this is the challenge of this kind of broader comparative study. So just pluses and minuses.
So the majority of our audience on culturefeed.com and on the Facebook page, Culturefeed Facebook page, are teachers and principals, some superintendents, school boards members, school board chairs, and they will be watching this interview. And so because they will not have read The Content of Their Character, I wonder if you could tell me, what was your purpose in visiting for such a long time, these 6 American high schools? And these were sample high schools, urban high schools.
Right. So I would first say to anyone watching, who is not my mom, thank you very much for watching and listening. And certainly I think the book is worth reading, despite my being in it. So I would encourage people to look at the book. It's really exciting study of 10 cases, sort of organized and shepherded by James Davison Hunter and others at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, asking up questions about moral formation and citizenship in various school sectors. And so originally, we had thought public schools would be one sector, but the more we thought about it, the more we realized that urban schools and rural schools are very different situations. And really suburban schools are actually a third piece that it would have been better to have tried to look at a bit more than we did. I got a little bit of suburban schools in mind, but not enough. So honestly, that would have been a third sector. And then charter schools were separate as well. But the 10 Case Studies project was predominantly religious cases, but then also homeschooling, charter schools, rural public schools, in my case, urban public schools. And I chose these 3 cities in consultation with Carl Bowman and James Hunter. I'm thinking about some geographic diversity, and also schools that had really been thinking about, their school districts that had been thinking about education reform pretty seriously. And San Diego, Charlotte, and New York City are all famous schools for ed reform, or famous districts for ed reform. And then, when I was in the schools, I just kind of hung out, sat in the back, observed classes, interviewed quite a few students and teachers in each school, and got a sense of how things worked.
Thank you. And my first real question is, were there any surprises you encountered in these schools that you had not expected in terms of how moral formation is attempted and or achieved? So was there anything you didn't expect? And I don't know what you brought to this school sector in terms of what your foreknowledge was, but were there any surprises that you encountered? Oh, I had expected this and I found this through the research.
Sure. I was surprised by how apologetic or dismissive teachers were about their role in society. The way teachers are sort of trumpeted as moral heroes by certain people, and I guess, they're described as evil leeches by others, but I've always deeply admired teachers. I was a high school teacher for a while. There's a part of me that wishes I still was a high school teacher, and I thought it was interesting the degree to which teachers emphasized their being a teacher as simply one profession among many. In a way that, in hindsight, is actually deeply democratic. There's a way that priests and nuns do this now too, right? That like this is my way of serving God, but maybe you do it your way, right? And there's a way that makes a lot of sense, and not to be stereotypical, but goes all the way back to Tocqueville and his early study of American equality. Not telling anyone else what they do is worse or better. But I actually think that's wrong. I think teachers are better than a lot of people. I think they're committed to helping others and doing work for the demos for society in a way a lot of people aren't. A lot of people only help the world to the extent the world is their family, and they're very dedicated to their family and a small circle of friends, and everything else is their own personal self-advancement. And teachers are actually deeply committed to having their career be in service. I find that incredibly admirable, and actually a better way of living than other ways of living. And it was interesting to me how when I said that to teachers, it made them uncomfortable. They didn't want to say their way of living was actually super. I mean, some did, but most would say this is my way of being my best self. But who am I to say, what's the best way to live?
So do you think they were modest then, some of them? Modest or self-deprecating?
They might have been modest and self-deprecating. It's possible, but I think there's actually a bigger sociological thing at play. I think that there's actually a deep kind of American institution of individualism that really makes it hard for us to make strong judgments about others' life choices. And the older I get, the more ambivalent I am about things. In some ways, that's good. In some ways, that's bad, right? I think it's better than having a very judgmental series of interactions all the time when people tell you when people tell each other they're living the wrong life,
or pointlessly, right?
Yeah, but also it's just interesting. I mean, I think that is actually a better life, and it's interesting to me that the justification for being a teacher is one means of self-actualization and one means of sort of vocational fulfillment among many versus actually morally superior to other choices.
Thank you. Moving on, you indicated that your research produced a straightforward result. Mm-hmm. You found that urban public schools were dedicated to 2 layers of morality: a commitment to helping for teachers and to self-actualization for students. Can you please help me understand, and others, what you mean by that?
Yeah, so, and you see this reflected kind of all the way up. And so certainly for me as a sociologist of education, this shows up consistently in the sociology of education literature as well, not explicitly, but implicitly. And then it also shows up in a substantial amount of the ed reform literature and discourse and discussion. So basically what it means is we want students to have agency. That's really what it means. We want students to feel like they're capable of making choices and able to commit to those choices and to follow through with grit, or whatever word you want to use, to be functioning members of society. And certainly, though, at least the way the teachers think about it, and a lot of the education reformers think about it, they really want students to succeed. They want students to go to college, to thrive, to have as many options as possible, to really have a robust sense of agency and capacity to be who they want to be. Yet what's interesting about that is it's a lot of means with very little end. There's not really a really robust sense of what that agency is towards, or about the kinds of people they should be once they enter the middle class or get into college. Now, they should do that, and that's the general concern. But what they do when they're there is kind of left up to them, and there's kind of a sense of what I call in the essay the moral invisible hand. This kind of idea that if everyone is their best self, magically society kind of works itself out, and we don't have to think hard questions about what the good life is, or the kinds of people we should be, or the kinds of people we should form students into being. So that's for students, but then for teachers, there is a sense of compassion, of care, of wanting students to be better. Most of the teachers I encountered, they became teachers because they care about kids and they want kids to succeed. And again, what was interesting to me was that the lack of a need to translate that caring from a teacher level to the student level. The one thing that did have to translate was respect, and so you had to treat each other with respect in the classroom. And this, to use a political theory term, this is an example of what John Stuart Mill, the liberal philosopher in some ways helped develop liberalism, calls the harm principle. And so the really key idea here is that you can't harm anybody. Society's not going to work if we harm each other. So we have to sort of commit to not harming each other. And a kind of slightly more positive version of that is everyone needs to be treated with at least respect. And I think that's great, obviously. And again, just like the commitment to students' agency, it's a necessary starting place. And there are far too many schools that don't have that. But one of the challenges, of course, is that it doesn't do much by itself. It's a good starting place, but it's just a starting place. And the example I give a lot is if a girl is alone crying at a lunch table, and your school has a robust anti-bullying program, via the harm principle, you can't, or the anti-bullying program, you can't walk up and hit that kid or tease her for crying. And you might be positively obligated to stop her from being bullied if you see someone doing it. But you have no positive obligation to walk up and check on her. You have no positive obligation to go be nice to her and see why she's suffering or what's wrong. That would go beyond just agency, or beyond the harm principle, or beyond anti-bullying policies, to actually think more robustly about citizenship and more robustly about democracy. And when I say democracy, I don't necessarily mean
just voting.
No, and I don't necessarily mean what it means in the original Greek, which is ruled by the people. What I really mean is the demos itself, right? Like the commitment to being a citizen and part of a community, and thinking about your robust relationships within that community and obligations to that community.
So what you didn't see were students in these public schools that you studied going out of their way, feeling obligated, feeling a sense of need to care and help others who were in some form of distress. The focus was they might do that, but it wasn't something you would expect them to do, nor did you see them do consistently.
I mean, no, they were, kids. There were a lot of kids that really felt like they had friends. There were people who knew them, who would check on them if they were sad. There's certainly, for many of the students, they were very nice communities. But for other students, they weren't, right? And there wasn't necessarily a commitment among the students to help those kids, or to be there for those kids, or to think about their obligations to them. And so there's a way that a smaller school, or a school with a more robust sense of identity, can think of itself more along those sort of tighter communal lines than a larger especially a large public school.
But was it apparent in any of the schools you studied that there was a deliberate program, a deliberate orientation, a deliberate plan for encouraging all students to develop a sense of citizenship and morality that extended to helping others in need? Mm-hmm. Or was that incidental, or more a byproduct, or happenstance, or it was nice if it happened?
Right. I would say it was generally incidental. I would say there were a few mechanisms, like at one of the schools I studied in New York, there was a real commitment to conflict resolution. So that's still kind of an after the fact thing. But there
It's a repair, right?
Right. But there was a real commitment to sort of robust repair because there is a real problem in low-income schools of school expulsions to suspensions eventually leading to prison time and all sorts of real problems there. And people call it the school to prison pipeline. And so, thinking about how we can do that in different ways is very important. And so there was, and so there were, programs like that. There were also, there was a school where they wore bracelets to sort of indicate if they were the kind of person you could talk to if you were having a bad day or something. So, I mean, like, things like that showed up, but they were all either kind of after the fact or bottom up in certain kinds of ways. And teachers were impressed by it when it happened. I mean, the teachers liked it, right? It's not like they thought that was silly. They were really excited about it, but it was sort of always felt of a secondary to the school's primary goal, which is test scores and college placement. I mean, that is really why the schools exist. Are we getting the kids into college? Are we making sure they do well on these tests? So, and that was such a constant concern in these schools that it was very hard for teachers to and even students to feel really empowered to do much of anything else.
I wondered if there were any schools you studied where they thought that attention to moral formation in students, to character building, to citizenship building, was in fact at the expense of the work to get good test scores. Were they mutually exclusive, or did some people feel?
I mean, all of them.
All of them.
I would say all of them. I would say almost every teacher I talked to would say this is the kind of stuff that I got into teaching to do, and I just don't have time or the energy or I lack the language sort of talk about it. And I should be clear here. I mean, it's never a question of whether kids are moral. It's for me as a sociologist of morality, it's a question of how they're moral, right? Like, very few people are immoral. I mean, maybe certain sociopaths or something don't have any real commitment, but everyone has a certain vision of a good life, a certain understanding of what a successful human being in a human life looks like, right? And the challenge is that they often differ, right? And part of the trick of public education and just democratic education is getting people to sort of coexist with each other amidst those differences, and getting people to be committed to the community in general. And that is one of the challenges of a liberal education, liberal in the very broad sense of not left wing or even right wing, but just focused on individual rights, is who are you to say that my kid should care about people, right? Like, why should my kid care about that kid at the lunch table? That's not his job. That's not why he's paid. Doesn't the school have counselors who can deal with that? Like, my kid's job is to do the best
himself.
Look after himself, do the best he can, get into college, be very wealthy, and then pay taxes, and then his taxes will go and help people. And then he's doing his job. And who are you to tell me that my kid should help this girl or should spend time outside of his school day to do things unrelated to his later goals,
personal achievement. So did you get the sense that there was pressure on schools not to pursue altruism because of parental discontent with that, or was that
just fear? I didn't actually. I mean, it was interesting. That's certainly what I heard. Yeah, teachers would say, well, parents wouldn't like it. I never heard parents not liking it, though. I mean, it was something people brought up as a kind of potential future criticism, but I didn't actually. I mean, I didn't talk to parents that much, but I did talk to parents, and generally but they weren't doing it. So maybe that's why the parents didn't bring it up to me. I don't know. I mean, I will say parents, when they did complain a lot about, like, there's not enough AP classes, or, there should be more test prep. So, I mean, parents are, and there's a stereotype of suburban, urban parents are somehow totally different than suburban parents. And there's a lot of urban parents of kids in very quote unquote low achieving schools, or schools with very, very high free and reduced lunches, which tends to be a lot of how we divide schools. And these parents are just as, kind of obsessed with achievement, right, as parents in the sort of more stereotypical suburban schools. So parents are obsessed with achievement. And so, like, the achievement bug has it infected the body politic? Has it infected the body politic writ large? Yeah. And I'm sure lots of teachers have identified and experienced this, right? And so it's really hard to get around, right? Because, I mean, one of the challenges with there's obviously a lot of good to a concept of meritocracy, right? There's a tremendous amount of good to the idea that if you're wealthy, you should earn it. If you're rich or important, you should earn it. You shouldn't just have it because you grew up with it. Right. Shouldn't be handed it. It shouldn't just be handed to you. The problem is it still usually is in this society. And the logic of meritocracy can provide a veneer for that to make it seem as though you have earned it, when in reality, you were born on third base and thought you hit a triple. And so this way of thinking can actually create a massive amount of stress, right? Because for who? For parents and kids, but especially parents even more than kids. And this is in lots of the literature. And you see this especially actually on literature on first generation college students. Because if you buy into the meritocratic logic, if you don't make it, it's your fault. And you actually don't deserve the middle class. You don't deserve a college degree, right? You tried and you couldn't cut it, right? And so there are all these ways that people like me, who I went to a Jesuit prep school, and two parents went to college. I was a very middle class kid. I had certain advantages and possibilities open for me. And I didn't even really realize that until I got to Yale for graduate school. And then I learned how different the middle class is from the elite, right? Which is a whole other separate universe. And so, I mean, I'm really interested in how, and a lot of sociologists of education like me are interested in how those advantages pile up. But then also, what I'm interested in that some other sociologists of education aren't as interested in is how those are experienced and felt as morally delegitimizing. And what I mean by that is, if you buy in to the meritocracy language completely, and you don't have another kind of code or language, whether it's religious or anything else, of kind of self-worth and self-identification, and then you don't get that college, or you don't get that job, or you don't get that middle class, there's no reason for you to be alive. There's no purpose to your existence. And so, one of the things that really worries me about the logic of meritocracy in schools is how it can replace or substitute a deeper commitment to human dignity, regardless of effort. I don't care if you're the laziest kid in that school, you're still a good person who deserves dignity and respect, right? And there's a way that this is very American, and it's very old, and it's a certain kind of Protestantism. Work equals value, right? And so I think in many ways that's a good thing. I mean, I think have internalized that. But it can also be a very dangerous thing, and especially for kids, for high school kids, especially for kids for whom the work is hard. this is a long answer to your question, but
No problem.
yeah, that's I guess what I would say about that.
Thank you. Although this wasn't part of my original idea to ask you this question, I'm beginning to wonder if you think there are many people who decry modern young people because they're too privileged, they have it too easy, everything's handed to them. And yet, as I listen to you, I think there's a lot of pressure on young people in our schools, in high school. Did you get the sense that the students in the schools you visited and studied and spent quite a bit of time in, did you feel the students were privileged? Not privileged economically, maybe that's not even the right word. Did you think that they were having it too easy? Do you think everything was handed to them? Do you think life was a bowl of cherries, a piece of cake? Or what? And listening to your earlier answer, or do you think they really, most of them felt the pressure, felt the heat, felt the need to perform, felt the need to measure up, were aware that the consequences of not working hard might be impoverishment or a life without fulfillment?
I mean, a significant amount of these kids are on free and reduced lunch.
Right. That means they're poor kids, right?
Yeah, that means they're low-income kids.
Right.
And, if you've ever eaten free and reduced lunch and then had friends who don't, that's not easy. And so,
Is
anybody.
it humiliating?
I mean, I wouldn't say humiliating. There's ways you can sort of hide it in a minute. Look, schools are better and worse at this, right? But so there are ways that schools can kind of mask it, but you still know, right? And I think a lot of kids get used to it, and it's just one thing among many. But there are lots of small ways that growing up low income affects you, right? You have to get a job and your friends don't. Your mom's not around. You have to watch your younger siblings because your mom's not around, right? So especially for these kids who are mostly low income, I would be pretty frustrated if someone said they were privileged or they were selfish or didn't know what they wanted. Now, if we're talking about suburban public school kids, who I think that's generally who they're talking about when you're saying that.
But you didn't study them, right?
I didn't really study. I studied one school that had a little bit of those kids.
Right.
No, I take that back. Both of the schools in San Diego were actually a big mix, so it definitely had kids like that.
Okay.
And for those more suburban kids, in some ways that's true. I mean, parents give them a lot more options, but parents also give them a lot less freedom. I mean, there's a reason why today's kids have a lot less sex and drink less booze than their parents' generation did, or even my generation did, and it's because of helicopter parenting. Is they're constantly texting with their parents
under surveillance.
Yeah, they're in constant. I mean, I was sort of just free range kid, and I was one of the last. I'm 37 now, and I think I was one of the last generations to be that, because I didn't have a cell phone until I was 22.
Right.
And so, I think there's just a very different way to be a kid now for middle class kids that is much more policed, is much more surveyed. In some ways, therefore, is easier, but in some ways is actually much more stressful because there is a ton more expectation. And that was true of the low income kids as well. That there's a lot of expectation about who you're going to be and how you're going to be that person. And then, this is a separate thing. But then if you're in your 20s, then you have a crippling amount of student debt often. And so,
Right.
there are all kinds of ways that I'm just our young. I would say the one thing that's true is young people are probably more distractible. That's the one stereotype that I think is right. But I would say that's true of old people now too. I think just anyone with a cell phone is more distractible.
Which is everyone.
Which is everybody. But I think that's true. That cell phones have made all of us more distractible, and that is a problem for
all of us.
Kids and the teachers. Honestly, the teachers will keep checking their phone, and so I mean, that's a struggle, and I think that is a real difference. But I actually think the bosses complaining about that are also checking their phone.